Welcome to the symposium presented by Taylor Huber, where we will embark on the great conversation. Please follow for updates and share if this podcast has impacted you. Now, on to this week's episode.
This week we will discuss Karl Barth's theology of creation as part of our series, Protestants that Catholics should read. So we're going to look at Karl Barth through that lens of how and why should a Catholic read Karl Barth, and actually how are a lot of ways that his theology is actually Catholic. It doesn't fall into the pitfalls that you see a lot of evangelicals fall into when they discuss creation, or the Reformed when they discuss creation. Now, those two pitfalls become evidently clear when you see and understand and learn about Karl Barth's theology of creation. Now, what's distinct about Karl Barth's theology of creation will stand out once I talk about these pitfalls. So pitfall number one is we must have a literal interpretation of Genesis. That if you're reading Genesis literally, and by that they mean scientific literal, that everything has to be understood. Each day has to be 24 hours, and they have to create this scientific, literal view because they're trying to combat evolution. They see evolution as a threat. They see it as a compromise or an insult to the scriptural text. Now, the scriptural text isn't even aware of evolution. It was written in a very different context, and that is evident. But because if you have a literal interpretation of Genesis, if you read it closely, it's not describing a globe, it's describing a dome. And if you want to know more about that, just look up John Walton. He's a professor up at Wheaton, talks a lot about this. You can go on your merry way and look at that. Now, I'm going to dial it back down and discuss what Karl Barth does. He's concerned with a Christian doctrine of creation. Now, how's that different than maybe the typical Reformed way of talking about creation? Well, from my experience, the Reformed will try to explain the why of what caused God to create, because what's motivating God? Well, the only thing that motivates the Reformed view of God is God's power and God's glory. God's power and God's glory. Now, these are very abstract. Why does God care about his power and glory? Now, concepts of power and glory get tipped on their head when the Savior of the world comes in humility and weakness. So it's hard to relate to a God and call God's most valuable thing as power and glory. When Jesus says, if you know me, you know the Father, you have to go through Jesus to really understand what power is, what glory is. And this is what Karl Barth does. But Karl Barth's theology starts with a faith statement. It doesn't start with natural theism or natural theology, which, if you're a fan of natural theology, all power to you. I just think this idea of trying to work backwards through reason and say, well, we see things exist. Well, all things that exist have been moved to exist, so there must be some greater being, an unmoved mover, that caused all of this. You know, that's a basic Greek understanding of creation, of how things exist. It's very Aristotelian, and it's probably the one area I struggle with Thomas Aquinas. But essentially, you can build up your natural theology. It's never, ever going to reveal you the God who's revealed in Jesus. So why wouldn't I just start with Jesus? Because Jesus is the reason, using Karl Barth's theology, Karl Barth's perspective, Jesus is the reason that you're trying to come up with natural theology. That you see only Christians doing this, really, and are motivated to. Well, why don't we just stay with Jesus? Since we're going to get a clearer view of the God we're trying to extrapolate. Now, this is a note from the Catechism. The same point. It starts with the faith statement, I believe in God, the Father, the creator of heaven and earth. Catechism 280 says, creation is the foundation of all God's saving plans, the beginning of the history of salvation that culminates in Christ. Okay, that word culminate is big. It is a important word because it means if something culminates, then that means the reason you set out to do that thing is for the culmination. Another term for that would be telos. It's the Greek word for like goal or reason or purpose. So if creation is purposed to culminate in Jesus Christ, that means God prioritizes Jesus before creation. Now we're talking about Jesus here, the God-man. That means Jesus, the human being, is the reason that all things exist. You know, that's what Colossians says. Colossians 1 says, in him and through him, all things exist, are held up by his power. He's talking about Jesus. Now, Karl Barth says the same thing. A commentator in the Essential Karl Barth Reader says, God's act of creation always must be seen in relation to the saving action of Jesus Christ. It's exactly what the Catholic Catechism says. And if God's act of creation is to be lodged in with Jesus Christ, that means that God's desire to be in relationship with Jesus is the foundation of creation. It's that relationship with Jesus. Now, if Jesus is the pinnacle, is the most human being, and is also God, that means covenant is actually the reason that God created the world. That the relationship with a community that we would say at one time was Israel and is now the church is the reason that all things exist. That God desired to be in relationship with something other than himself. Now that's going to rub the Reformed definitely the wrong way, because it sounds like I'm saying that God was lacking something. And I don't think this desire came from a lack, but from Jesus, from this connection that God desired to have. And it has to culminate through the covenants that God transpired. So God's reason for creation is to be in partnership with humanity, first and foremost, first through Jesus. Now, does that mean that God had to create? Does that make God bound to creation? Well, Barth would say no. God is absolutely free. He is a free creator, and he decided and he initiated that he is not overpowered, or he is not held to some outside decree other than his own will and his own purposes. But you can start seeing how his doctrine of creation is utterly different. He's not focusing on trying to prove Genesis happened, literally, scientifically, and he's not trying to extrapolate this view of God that is distant or more mathematical than relational. that God is one who is intimately connected, but utterly different. Now, this goes in contrast to Martin Luther's theology, who sees the tension between God, the divine, and humanity, the creature, the divine and creature distinction as as a relationship that is always in conflict, which is why Luther can only look at the cross and see God's wrath and see his sin, and that the love of God, the mercy of God, is only secondary in relation to the first understanding. While Barth will say, no, the fact that God created, the fact that God became man and dwelt among us, means that God is utterly for us. That the reason all things exist is to be elevated into Christ through the redemption of the world when he returns. That's why covenant is so important, in that it's a covenant based on grace. Now, there's people who go and there's a theologian named Thomas Schreiner, and in his book I read in seminary, God and God's Covenant, Covenant and God's Purposes to the World, he makes a note saying that the historical Reformed understanding of covenant is covenants are always redemptive and given to human beings who have sinned. Well, Barth's theology contradicts that, because it doesn't view covenant as a contract. It doesn't view it as a course correction, but as the definitive plan A, that God has always intended for Jesus Christ to become incarnate, to live among us, to die and raise again. Now, how sin, providence, evil factor into that, I'm not going to talk about that right now. But that God, the creation, and Jesus are not plan B. That Jesus is plan A and is always plan A. And that this is why God created is out of his benevolence, as the Catechism says. So as Catholics, like we should cling. We should look deeper into Barth's theology of creation, because it's one first and foremost based upon the love that God has for his Son, and through his Son as his humanity represents the image of God. God's love then flows to the rest of creation and to people who are in his covenant. And as that love flows to the rest of creation, that means God's creation is always good. Always good. That God looks at us as worth saving because we are made in the image of God. And that image of God is the image of Jesus Christ, for he is the perfect reflection. He is the perfect image of God, and he's the archetype of who God created all of humanity in. That means all of creation is tied up with God's love for Jesus. And that means God will always be committed in his freedom to continue to allow creation to exist. That God has a promise never to destroy the world, never to let the creation fade, but that he will always renew it. And that's why we have a hope, not just of life after death, but life after death, which is the resurrection, that God has a promise to renew his good creation. There's so many people who I talk to in my work that they just think about what they're going to do when they die, or that this world is evil, this world is not my home, and that nothing in me is good, I am utterly wicked, and needing to be freed from this flesh. No, this world is good. This world is worth saving. That God started this world and he is not going to abandon it. And we know he won't abandon it because his love for all things that exists goes right through Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ is both creature and divine at the same time. So in order for the creation to exist, Jesus has to always be ruling and reigning, and God will never turn his back on his Son. So that should give us a sure hope that there is always hope in this world. That God is always around the corner in his love and his freedom. Barth calls God the one who loves in freedom. That God is able to act in ways we cannot fathom. For none would have fathomed that, one, God would create such a world as ours, and two, that God would save it through Jesus Christ. That's all I got today. Thank you for tuning in and really meditate, really think about the implications of how looking at creation through the lens of Christ and not just trying to justify through some materialistic means that God created the universe, or trying to postulate some arbitrary reasons why God created to justify his glory and power, but that God created so that he might always redeem it through Jesus, and that he might elevate it and bring it into perfection. Thank you. This has been this week's episode of Symposium. Tune in next week and we will dive into Karl Barth's Doctrine of Reconciliation. God bless.